Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. This is David Gellis here. I'm a business reporter at the New York Times and the corner office columnist. Today, I'm happy to welcome Matt Mullenweg, founder and CEO of Automattic. That's the company behind WordPress, the digital publishing platform, as well as sites like Tumblr, Longreads, and other tools that power the web. Automattic has a highly distributed workforce with more than 1,000 employees in 77 different countries, speaking 93 languages. So we're excited to hear from Matt about distributed work because we're all at some level going through that right now. A quick housekeeping note, you can submit questions at any time during this event using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll get to those in a little bit. And please also note that this event is being recorded and is an audio-only event. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
It is a pleasure to be here.
So Matt, I wonder if you could take us back in time a bit and talk to us about the early days of Automattic. Because when you founded this company 15 years ago, in 2005, I remember you were based in San Francisco, and you, I think, even had an office there at the outset. But even then, you were very comfortable, as I understand it, hiring people who lived pretty far away from you, which was unusual for a startup, for a small company. What was your thinking about distributed work back then?
Yeah, we'd have to go back even further, 2 years before Automattic started, which is when WordPress started as an open source project. And I was in Houston, Texas, studying poli-sci at University of Houston. And I co-founded WordPress with a gentleman named Mike Little, who was in the United Kingdom, and I had never met in person. So from the genesis, and this is very common for open source projects, we were connected by a shared passion and an online community, not the fact that we had ever physically been in the same place. So a few years later, when Automattic started, the people who I'd already worked with and gotten to know and seen their talents and their ability were already around the world. So the first ever employee was in Ireland. Then we had Vermont, Texas. I was in San Francisco. I had moved at that point, but it was just very, very natural to bring people from wherever they are and not move them to what even in 2005 was an expensive place to be, San Francisco. For offices, we generally and still sometimes squat in our investors or vendors' offices. So we were in the True Ventures office for our first year or two.
Okay. And do you think, I understand that sort of distributed work is perhaps part of the culture in the open source community, but I wonder when it came time to formalize the company, as it were, was there not sort of an impulse to get everyone in the same place? Or having not necessarily grown up in that kind of a culture and not worked in that kind of a culture, did it not even cross your mind? Again, it's hard to overstate sort of what a break from tradition this would have been some 15 years ago.
It crossed my mind all the time because pretty much every investor I talked to, including all the ones that said no, said you can't do this. It's just not going to work. Or it'll work up to 20 or 25 people, or maybe to Dunbar's number, but there's no other super successful company that's been built this way. So why even try? And to be
just briefly,
candid, I thought they might be right. I didn't know.
And why? What was their main argument? What was their biggest fear, as it were, about why this couldn't
work? There's always a very intangible, sort of like a magic that people imagine happens in an office that's necessary for innovation or design, or maybe not being in the same place is fine for engineers, who at that time were perceived as being in closets, drinking Mountain Dew and eating pizza, but it wouldn't work for designers or finance people or other roles. And so there was a lot of biases, and to be honest, a lot of success and experience. I think it's hardest to change when you've been successful doing something in the past. It's easy if it didn't work, but most of the history prior to the ubiquitous availability of broadband was companies mostly, and certainly great companies, being built in person.
You didn't listen to their advice, much to your credit. And why was that? What did you feel like perhaps who knew if you were going to lose out on some of those intangibles? But it seems clear at that point you already believed you were going to gain something. And I wonder if you could talk about that. What gave you sort of the resolve to double down on this model, even as investors really tried to persuade you to do otherwise?
Well, we really just tried to judge it by the results. You know, even today, I would be open-minded to like having uh, an office for a specific team or to accomplish something for Automattic, if we could measure that and check the results and compare it to other approaches. So it was really just seeing how we were doing and being very satisfied with the growth and adoption of our products and how we were working together and innovating, particularly over the past 15 years,
Mm,
which is long term, and being satisfied with it. What it taps you into is, of course, the ability to tap into the global talent pool. There are maybe 50 years ago, the the good engineers had all gone to the same college or in the same geography. But now with the internet, there is, uh, you know, an equality of access to things, particularly in technology, to learn. And so you don't have to go to a specific college or really any college or even high school sometimes to be amazing designer, coder, writer, whatever it might be, because there's so many different ways to learn that don't have those traditional gatekeepers or geographic barriers.
hmm could you take us just briefly inside your hiring process? Again, I think so many companies are probably locked into the mindset of the people who are going to apply for a job are the ones who live in that area, or perhaps some smaller subset are those who are willing to relocate. What does it look like when anyone in the world can apply for any job at Automatic?
I imagine, like most companies, we do a lot of work to ensure our hiring process is as fair as possible so that everyone has an opportunity at a job. Now, we do take a few approaches that some companies would find quite radical. So, one we already talked about, which is we hire people in, or we can hire people in almost every country. It's not every country, but almost everyone. Um, there's a few sanctioned countries and things like that. Um, one thing we do is for the vast majority of our roles, the hiring process is entirely over chat. It's over text. So you could be hired and in fact start a job at Automattic without ever seeing or talking to a person in real time. If you wanted to, of course, we're not going to say no if you want to have a video chat or something. But yeah, if you want to do it on text, you totally can. And in fact, one frequent thing people hired at Automattic tell me is that their spouse or partner didn't believe it was a real job. They were worried they were getting scammed. So um, that also removes a ton of opportunities for unconscious bias, or could maybe allow people for whom their written English is better than their spoken English, as one example, to get through our hiring process and really shine. So we're always looking at what are things we can do to just make it as much about the work and as much
Mm.
about how we work every day as possible. And
Just
remove all
to
that extraneous stuff like how you're dressed, how you showed up, how like you sound, how you look, where you live. All those things ultimately don't matter, particularly for an internet company. So let's just remove it from the process entirely.
That's fascinating. And just to probe a little bit there, I mean, as a writer, I like the sound of that, but I have friends who would argue that they're actually better in-person communicators than they are necessarily writers. And I wonder, have is that the kind of situation where you would accommodate an in-person interview, for example? In other words, is there not also a risk in creating some unconscious bias or against those who might not be as proficient communicating in the written word? Or is that something you look for as a prerequisite to a successful career at Automatic?
I think bias, both conscious and unconscious, is always there. You just try to manage it. Um, we do have roles for which you know, the in-person, say, charisma or presentation skills or something is important. Like let's say a sales role, an enterprise sales role. So that might be one where you do a video interview or mock sales pitch as part of
Mm.
your hiring process. Um, I will also say that one thing we choose to bias towards is writing ability. So
Mm-hmm.
we look for it a lot. I actually don't care at all about where you went to school or anything. And in fact, as you go global, it's even hard to know like what is the MIT of Sri Lanka or India or something like that. So you just you remove those as filtering mechanisms. But I think clear writing is a sign of clear thinking, and so
Yeah.
it is something that we look for in people we hire. And so if you were going to apply for Automattic, probably the most important thing you can do is the cover letter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
But that's true, and we try to make it explicit, and we also try to on our website put resources for how to be a better writer,
yeah.
so people can learn.
As someone who makes his living by writing, I support that decision. A quick reminder: this is
I
David
guess there's an
Geddes.
assumption there as well, which is that I believe that everyone can learn to be a better writer.
Yeah, and I
So
think
that
what
could
you
be
said, that
incorrect, but
clear writing is a sign of clear thinking, is something that's hard to argue with. And I think a lot of people would find real truth in that. Just briefly, this is David Geddes, reporter at the New York Times, corner office columnist. I'm talking with Matt Mullenweg, the founder and CEO of Automattic, and you can ask him questions through the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll get to those in a little bit. So Matt, you mentioned some of the doubts that investors and others had about this model, and I wonder to what extent you have found limitations to a fully distributed workforce. Uh, are some of the worries, the concerns they had about uh, building a company culture, about trying to work across time zones and keep teams functioning efficiently, have those things ultimately at some level been difficult over the years?
definitely. I say everything about building a company is difficult at various parts. And any organizational structure, including a distributed one like we've chosen, has trade-offs. I do believe that if you unlock the highest levels of a distributed organization, though, the talent and effectiveness and happiness in your employees and everything that you get access to far outweighs the fact that I'll tell you one thing I don't like about it. Um, I really like my colleagues and I like hanging out with them and I miss them, particularly right now in this pandemic. Normally we do meetups where we see each other a few times a year, and that's obviously off the table right now. And it's sometimes with a tinge of jealousy or FOMO when I visit an amazing office, like say Stripe's office, and say like, wow, it'd be cool to have lunch with the people I work with every day.
Mm,
Now you unlock something else. You can have lunch with your friends or with your family or with your kids or whatever it is. So you gain access to something else. But there's a trade-off there.
yeah. Well, we're
What
all
I don't believe
learning.
there's a trade-off in is ineffectiveness. I actually believe that a distributed organization could be up to 20, 30% more effective than even the best in-person organization, particularly once you get above a certain size. Above, call it 50. You're not on the same floor of the building anymore. You can't fit everyone in a conference room. That's when distributed really starts to shine. I could see an argument for a very, very small team. If you can all be around the same table, um, that's nice.
And so talk about that. Talk about when it was in the company's evolution where you believe started to see the productivity benefits of the distributed workforce, as it were, and why it is. What do you think is different about a distributed workforce compared to having everyone in the office that actually has the potential to unlock more productivity?
I think when we first started, we actually had a lot of it in that, we were pretty global. Um, there was a good asynchronicity. So, for example, I remember I would often, these are also like the days when you're kind of working crazy hours and stuff. So I would like often pass off what I was working on around midnight to my colleague who was in Ireland. And then when I woke up the next morning, he had kind of done a full day on it. And that was really nice, right? You could almost get like multiple shifts in the same thing, which if you're working 2 or 3 shifts in a 24-hour period and your competitor is working one, you're going to move faster. I think as we started to get to that 50, 100, 150 people, we actually regressed a little bit, that's probably the time when we started to try to emulate things about in-person companies more. We even famously signed a 7-year lease on a 15,000 square foot office in San Francisco, expecting that we'd have people in it. And so we made tons of mistakes along the way. And and it's only, I would say, the last couple of years that we really started to embrace um, the advantages of being distributed versus trying to recreate the office.
Hmm. Eh, I I want to come back to this notion because I think it's pertinent to just about every uh, office worker out there right now, and all the managers who are trying to figure out exactly how they keep their teams running and their employees, if not happy, then at least contented in these difficult times. But first, I want you to just talk about the company itself a little bit. Could you describe what Automattic is today? I think a lot of people have heard of WordPress, but might not really know all the things it powers these days. And then also talk to us about Tumblr, which you acquired last year, and help us understand the rationale behind that. So what is Automattic today?
Sure. Um, our mission is to democratize publishing and commerce. Our big products there are WordPress, which now powers 37% of the top 10 million websites in the world, which is more than 10 times the number two in the market. So we have, a majority of the market and growing faster than anyone else in the market too. So that's been our most successful. WooCommerce is an e-commerce engine built on that, which is now doing billions of dollars of goods per month sold. So think of it like an open source Shopify. And then, like you mentioned, last year we acquired Tumblr, which is a product that was a contemporary of WordPress.com for many years, sold to Yahoo for $1 billion. And then Yahoo merged with AOL, and then that sold to Verizon. And always had a ton of respect for that product and that team, and loved how Tumblr enabled really creative blogging and tons of creators and creativity on it. And so when we heard it might be shut down, we figured out a deal where we could actually take it over, and we're going to do or have been doing our best to really revitalize it. It has a ton of users still, including celebrities like Taylor Swift, and we're trying to bring it onto our technology stack and open it up in the ways that Automattic usually does, and hopefully can create a place on the internet that's safe, fun, and creative. A
Mm,
good
mm.
alternative to other social networks.
Noted. I think a lot of people would like good alternatives to lots of social networks these days, but we'll save that for later. Uh, Talk about acquiring Tumblr though, because this was your largest acquisition, and it had, I imagine, a large established team with their own habits, their own culture. What was it like bringing that company into Automattic? Were there things that the Tumblr team had to unlearn? Were there things that you had to try to instill in the Tumblr team?
I think when you do an acquisition right, there's a lot of influence both ways, right? They had created something which has captured a zeitgeist of culture for basically a decade now. And so there's a lot of wisdom embedded in the processes and the culture and the way people work together. But what happens at every company, including Automattic, um, is you have a lot of things which were concurrent with your success, but not necessarily the cause of it. And so, when you combine two companies, you say, okay, what was the thing that really makes it successful, and what just we do because we did it before. Um, Tumblr also was pretty strong in their office. About two-thirds of their people would go into their
Mm-hmm.
office. But they did have a pretty good distributed component as well. Like I said, about a third of their folks at the time of acquisition were not in New York. Um, I think that one of the big adjustments for them was trying to put the folks not in the office at a more equal footing versus a hub and spoke model. Something we heard from a lot of the folks who weren't in New York was that they felt they need to visit New York frequently. And in fact, when people from Automattic were rotating onto the Tumblr team, I told them, like, you need to be there at least once a month, probably a week a month, because that's how they're currently operating. And so to be part of that team, that's
Mm-hmm.
what you need to do. Now, the pandemic, obviously, we had planned to move to totally distributed over kind of a few years. In fact, I think we were about to move into a new office for Tumblr, um, but the pandemic accelerated, and I feel like um, the team now is basically 100% distributed and just as accomplished and great at it as anyone else in the company. So, and I've seen that at other companies too. It's been it's one of my life missions to have more companies be distributed and be able to work in this way because I feel like it's good for the environment, it's good for opportunity, it's good for employees, it's good for the economy. Um, and so to see how that's accelerated across really every company the past few months has been astounding to me. I wouldn't have
mm,
imagined it being much harder.
mm. And is
Not
that
to
to
say it's
say
been
that,
easy and all roses, but it's like it's just gone way better than I would have expected.
yeah, yeah. Is that to say that you feel like Tumblr employees may just never come back into the office? That this was sort of a rip the Band-Aid off moment?
So it's interesting. So one of the feedbacks that we heard a lot was in New York City, Manhattan particularly, you can't, it's expensive to have a lot of space at home. So working from home is not actually perhaps your ideal place to work, right? And actually, we don't have a no office policy. We're just office agnostic. And, we give everyone a co-working allowance of $250 per person per month if they want to spend that at a coffee shop or a co-working space like a WeWork or something. Um, so the Tumblr people were saying, hey, we don't want to work from home. I've got two roommates. I'm in a studio apartment or whatever it is. And that made a lot of sense. Now, of course, what happens when you give people the ability to be just as productive from anywhere? So participate equally in the work and also participate equally in promotions and raises, whatever they want, is where previously they might have optimized where they choose to live for, say, commute. Now they start to optimize for other things. And a very
Mm-hmm.
common pattern in Automattic is that when people get a job here, they move. In fact, we had to start asking people not to move in the first couple of months because it's a lot of change at once. And something we've started to see with my Tumblr colleagues is now that the pandemic started, now that they know that at Automattic they can be just as effective, and with how Tumblr's transformed, they're starting to move out of Manhattan. And you can move just 30 minutes away and get a lot more space or a yard for your dog or really optimize. So um, there's really good value all across America in terms of where you can live. I live
Yeah,
in Houston.
yeah, yeah. How do you though deal with compensation, especially when people move? Uh, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, of course, suggested that if people move to lower cost areas, they may see their compensation adjusted downwards, especially when you're hiring across such a wide variety of countries which have much different costs of living. How do you approach this? Do you have some baseline that you try to adhere to, or is it really calibrated by the cost of living in the country or the region where an employee starts?
I have a lot of empathy for companies that do cost of living adjustments, or pay differently because we used to as well. Um, But over time, when I started to think really critically about that policy, um, one, there's so much more than location that determines your cost of living. You can spend millions of dollars in Houston, or you could spend, very little in San Francisco. So there's a lot of personal choices. And so it felt a little almost paternalistic for the company to say that you should make more or less in one place or another, and or have sort of weird incentives for like moving someplace. Um, the other thing that just began to feel fundamentally unfair to me was why two people on the same team doing the same job, one in, let's say, California and one in Alabama, should make different money. Or when you take that as an axiom, why should someone in Alabama make different from someone in India? So what we've done over the past few years is actually move to where we do the same compensation bands for globally, actually. So it's not even just within the countries. Um, Wherever you're doing the work, you can have the opportunity to make the same amount. It's not perfect because we pay people in the local currency, and sometimes currencies can move quite a bit, and we have to
Mm-hmm.
adjust for that, usually over a few years. But it's always heading towards that, and we keep everyone in the same ranges now.
Mm-hmm. Um, you said something earlier that I can't get out of my mind, where you suggested Tumblr might be an alternative to existing social networks, and I wonder if in that remark was some criticism at a certain level of some of the dominant platforms out there. You, of course, wouldn't be alone, but I just wonder, could you expand on your thoughts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, to the extent that you have really strong views on the role that they're playing in society right now, in our democracy, when it comes to mental health? Is this an
Mm.
issue in which you're sort of taking a stand and feeling like Tumblr could be a viable alternative and could be structured in some fundamentally different ways to provide alternatives?
Yeah, you almost had the answer in your question there. Um, I use all of those. The only network I'm not really on is TikTok,
Mm-hmm,
and I see the value in those others. But I do wonder if fundamentally an advertising-driven business model is incompatible with maybe even democracy. And so Automattic is primarily subscriptions.
mm-hmm,
You know, the vast majority of our revenue is recurring subscriptions. Tumblr and a few other places do ads, but I'm very curious to explore if we can make them not solely dependent on ads. What incentives that creates for the product to evolve, and that could that provide like a third space, a space where, you know, the algorithms aren't driven to show you the thing that's going to get you the most riled up, or the advertising is not targeted in a way that shifts elections in ways that might, um, we might not want to have in society, or targets based on demographics in ways that could be discriminatory, like has come up with some of the networks that allow targeting based on, like say, race, and then there were advertisers using that to advertise certain things in certain places, including jobs, which I would consider discriminatory. So um, even if unintentional. So
mm-hmm,
that is what we're hoping to create something else. The good news is Tumblr is very active. You know, it's getting 60, 70,000 signups per day from its mobile app. So there's a lot of people coming through its front door every day. And I think we have an opportunity to create that other place. And that could be, you know, something that people go to feel that creativity. Kind of like
mm-hmm,
Instagram did in its early days, was one I
mm-hmm.
really enjoyed as an alternative to other places.
And how do you think about the question of identity, real identity, on Tumblr, and as that might compare to some of the other dominant platforms right now? You know, I look every day on Twitter and I see some of my colleagues being harassed
Mm-hmm.
by anonymous accounts, and
Mm.
it's pretty grotesque behavior.
Mm. Yeah, there is. That's a challenging one. And you actually hit on one of the things I think is really interesting about Tumblr, which is that people can have different identities pretty easily. And they
Mm-hmm,
often use that to express different interests or things they follow, or maybe different parts of themselves, or just a way to curate different lists. There's also a lot of private publishing on Tumblr. So if people wanted to say, just share photos with a few friends or have like a private blog, it's probably the best place to do that. Um, but there's always, I think, whether you have identity or not, there's abuse. Um, a good example of this is TechCrunch comments. You know, they switched to Facebook, using Facebook for their comments because they didn't want trolls. And then, you know, you can be quite astounded by the things people are willing to say under their real name. Facebook sort of famously having real identity. So I think you have to control not for identity. That's like a proxy. What you really want to optimize for is the behaviors. And you know, we've had a ton of experience in 15 years, you know, moderating a place where anyone can publish anonymously or not with WordPress.com. And so the tools and processes we've developed, we're integrating with the tools that Tumblr's developed over the years. And I think we'll be able to create something which can avoid the really bad stuff, protect freedom of speech, which is of course uh, important to us because sometimes minority or unpopular speech can be uh, on the right side of history. There's many examples of that, and then finally create a positive place for people to be. So that's really hard, by the way, and it gets harder the bigger you are. So please don't let me gloss over it or say that we're always going to be perfect at it, but we are trying our darndest, and I think I've had pretty good results so far.
Yeah. Well, it'll be fascinating to watch, especially as if Tumblr does continue to grow, how those sort of the weight of that increased scale does start to create some new stressors on the culture. We'll see. Just briefly, this is David Gevis talking with Matt Mullenweg. We'll get to audience questions in a few minutes. But first, Matt, I wonder if you could talk to us. about the last 4 or 5 months at the company. You were already distributed, so it might be the case that you were better positioned than other companies to deal with the pandemic, to deal with the sudden shift to remote working. But what was the experience? Some companies I've talked to have said that their employees are more productive. Others say the inverse is true. What's it been like at Automattic?
So I do believe that if you do distributed work well, you're a lot more productive. And if you want to see more about this, I have a blog post called Distributed Work's 5 Levels of Autonomy that go from level 0 to nirvana of how you can do it well. I think we were mostly at level 3 or level 4, which meant we were probably 20 or 30% more productive than most in-person companies. Now the pandemic has affected a lot of people's lives. Even if they're not catching it directly, schools canceled, people are working from home that might not normally work from home. So we definitely have seen a hit. Not to mention the stress of the time. There's an anxiety on what could happen, which I would say has been even compounded by the social unrest and the sort of awareness that's grown in the past month or two, kind of following George Floyd and others. That again is weighing on many of my colleagues, both in America and internationally. So we are doing our best, trying to be kind to each other because people can, when they're stressed out, they can be a little shorter on text or quick to escalate things or not assume positive intent. And also try to build time to take some time off, to recharge, because a lot of people are actually, one of the biggest problems you have with distributed work and remote work is typically overwork, not underwork. So part of why we track vacation time and what we call AFK, or away from keyboard time, is to notice when people aren't taking enough. And we had started to notice people weren't taking enough, probably because they were canceling their trips or things. So we've been encouraging people to keep that, because I do believe it's important for balance.
Hmm. And just talk to us briefly about these 5 levels of autonomy you mentioned. What does that spectrum look like? Because of course, for some companies, let's just state the obvious here, distributed work is not possible for some jobs, but for others, there's the potential to do it more and more. Talk to us about those 5 levels of autonomy, as it were.
Sure. So if a job can't be done when you're physically there, I call that level 0. And actually, what's amazing is how many things have been moving from level 0 to something you can do remotely. Like I would have imagined that being a doctor is something you had to do in person. But it turns out telemedicine can cover a ton of cases. And you're even seeing things like remote surgeries or remote construction that is starting to happen more and more. Um, Level 1 is when an organization really hasn't done anything to allow people to be productive when not in an office. That's where a lot of companies were. Level 2 is where you say, okay, we're going to allow people to not be in the office, but we're going to try to recreate everything we did in the office. So same meetings, same conference rooms, same ways of doing things. And this is the worst level because you get all the downsides of being in the office and all the upsides of being together. So level 2 is where a lot of people moved to right after the pandemic started. And I think rightly we're a little bit miserable. But the good news is when you go to through level 2, you start to get to level 3, which is when you become remote first, or what I would call truly distributed. And that's when you really start to embrace the tools of being distributed. So like you might have a meeting with a Google Doc on the screen for everyone and you take notes together. It's when your equipment starts to be pretty good. So maybe you invest in a good headset so everyone sounds good. People are able to get their home office set up well so that they're comfortable and ergonomic. And this is when people start to sort of feel, if you're feeling like happier at work or more balanced or like you're more creative at work, you've probably reached level 3. And then finally, level 4 is when you go asynchronous. So level 3 is still synchronous. Level 4 is when you do what I talked about earlier, where like the same project could pass between time zones, people working all over the world. This is when written communication gets really, really important and when people have a lot more flexibility in their day. So for example, one thing people love about Automattic is like even if an in-person office said, hey, it's totally fine if you want to go drop off your kids and pick up your kids every day. Just being in the office, you might feel awkward if you were to leave twice a day, or people might be scheduling meetings in that time often. But when you're distributed, you have a lot more freedom and autonomy. And that's, I think, the real beauty of being distributed is it really treats, people like adults and says, we have this expectation for what gets accomplished, but we're going to give you a lot of autonomy for how to accomplish it. And in that freedom, it breeds a lot of creativity and also allows for people who work differently to shine. As you move up the distributed levels, I feel like you'll start to unlock the genius of the introverts in your organization, which is statistically probably about 30% of the folks at your company that might not have done as well or might not have shown as much in that around a conference table meeting where everyone's reacting and talking to each other. So, and then level 5 is just nirvana. It's the thing that you never attain, but you always aim for. And you might see glimpses of it when you feel like everyone's happy, healthy, wise, rested, and bringing their best self to work.
Great. Well, as someone who has spent some time on a meditation cushion, I know that nirvana is something to aspire to, but that for the most part, we're going to be here in samsara, making our way through the day-to-day. But thank you for that. I mean, I think it provides a roadmap for so many companies that are trying to think about how they deal with this disruption, especially as it looks like it may well go on for many more months to come. We've got many audience questions here, and the first one just goes back to a fundamental thing, but I think we all want to hear more from you on it, which is how do you build and nurture culture without offices? And I would add to that, just especially with so many different real cultures, how do you create one cohesive one around a company?
To answer that, you kind of need to know how the person defines culture. I don't believe culture is your foosball table or the holidays you take together or, any of these other things. It's not your informal and arbitrary onboarding. It's not the schools people went to. It's not the emoji on the Slack. It's, to me, how I would define it is the interactions between every single person in the company every single day. It's what people do when folks aren't looking. It's what is important to people and what they prioritize. And that happens when any group of humans are together. The culture is happening with you, whether you want it to or not. And we try to do it consciously and deliberately, and both exhibit in the leadership the best practices that we want people to follow. And something very important to our culture is being open-minded to trying new things, even if it's the opposite of what's made us successful in the past. So if culture is a function of communication, I think that anything you do to foster better communication within your organization will as well increase the transmission of whatever people are doing that demonstrates the culture, both positive or negative.
Kathy asks, why do you feel there is such a mistrust on the part of so many bosses, employers for telework? Your comment about treating employees as adults is not widely shared, she says, sadly.
I do believe that if people really think through work and sort of examine all the assumptions and axioms and first principles of how they work and when they've been happiest working, that they will arrive at many similar conclusions as this, especially if they start to think of being as inclusive as possible. So I'm actually very optimistic that being distributed will help move managers who might be accustomed to being effective in one way to another way, because this is a new way of working. So what made you successful in the past will not necessarily make you successful in a distributed organization. And it's actually, I started a podcast called Distributed. It's at distributed.blog. And it's basically purely for middle managers and leaders, because it is harder, particularly if you've been successful in your career, to learn how to be very successful in a distributed fashion. For individual contributors, I think it's very easy because they might have been an academic or a writer or a freelancer before, so they've self-managed in this way. But to manage others, I think there is a learning curve.
I mean, I feel like implicit in some of what Kathy's asking about bosses and employers sort of mistrusting this arrangement is this suspicion that people won't work hard enough. And I want to hear your thoughts on what you've found to be both true and appropriate about the amount of time that people at Automattic work? And is there flexibility, and does that sort of rise and fall dependent on a project? Because I think one of the things that I've heard from some people is that they find that they can actually get a whole lot of work done in a much more condensed amount of time. They can be just as efficient, but actually while working fewer hours, because so much of their workday previously was filled up with things that ultimately weren't productive. Or conversely, they might be able to spend the same amount of hours working and accomplish even more. What's been your experience at the company about both, again, sort of taking advantage of a culture where there's less water cooler talk, there's less commuting time, but does that also unlock some of those freedoms that you alluded to earlier about having lunch with your friends and hanging out with your kids?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have roles in Automattic, like our support roles, which we call happiness engineer. We provide 24/7, 365 live chat support for every paying customer on WordPress.com. So you can speak to one of my colleagues any time of the day or night. To ensure that coverage, we do need to, that's almost like level zero in a way, that we need a certain number of
Mm-hmm.
people there at the time, so they need to be at the desk. For most other roles at Automattic, the what you're accountable for is a result. So at that point, I don't even know like how much someone is working. It's not as important. They could work 60 hours and not do a lot, or they could work 20 hours and do a ton. Um, so it really becomes on what is the result. And I do believe beyond a certain point, there's a diminishing marginal return to work. And I believe below a certain point, you're probably not going to be able to keep up with people who are working something around like a 40-hour work week or 5 days a week. So, there's at either extreme, you probably fall off, but in the middle of the bell curve, there's a lot of flexibility for how people approach that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, we've
And
got
that
one
it's
more.
fractal as
Go,
well.
please.
So
Yeah.
individuals can operate in a way. We also allow teams a lot of autonomy for how they operate, or divisions, and choosing what to allow people to try something different on and what not to. I'd say is one of the big struggles of our um, what we aspire to be as an organization.
I want to plug in one hole. I feel like you alluded to this, but I think a lot of people are asking about culture, and I suspect, especially as other companies think about what the future of all this looks like for them, they want answers to this question as well. And that is, do you get teams together at all in person over the course of the year in normal times? In other words, does the engineering team have retreats twice a year somewhere or other and you fly everyone in? Or is it the case that people can go years without actually ever meeting their colleagues in person?
Yeah, we used to. So we used to tell people to expect about 4 weeks of travel per year, 3 to 4,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe 2 of those weeks would be with your direct team, probably 10 people. 1 week would probably be like an external conference or event, and then 1 week we would bring together a much larger division, or sometimes even the whole company. And we thought this was pretty necessary. I have seen that, and we'll see as the pandemic goes, we're currently not planning to do those for the foreseeable future. Because again, bringing people together with 77 countries, with borders that are closing, visa issues, everything, um, I'm not sure how we're going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So we are currently planning to not do that. And I've been surprised by how virtual versions of these events, including like group trainings or meetups where people get together, unlock like a different way to approach things. Like instead of everyone being together for 5 days and it being kind of like a 12-hour a day thing, you could do like a 3-hour day thing for 2 weeks. And that could be like an easier way for people to incorporate it. And there's lots of ways to bring people together and communicate. And I think one of the beauties of when you go fully distributed is you can bring people together that bring a perspective, a point of view, and a diversity, which is not just being from a place, but living all in Mountain View, but actually going to bed every night, waking up every morning in a completely different culture. And like you alluded to earlier, that brings its own challenges, but I think it also unlocks just an incredible wisdom for all the research we know for how diverse teams create better outcomes. It allows the type of diversity that no in-office company could ever match.
Mm. I'm going to give the last question to a listener. Joe asks, if you were building a startup today, you were starting this company not 15, 17 years ago, but right now, what would you do differently than you did in building Automattic and WordPress? What would you do differently from the start?
Well, one thing that's cool is that a lot of startups now are building distributed from the start, and
Mm.
most of the ones I invest in. And there's a lot of other examples besides Automattic, like GitLab, Envision, Elastic, which IPO'd. So there's dozen plus multi-billion-dollar companies doing this. So I'd do that again. One thing I would probably do, and this is very specific, is that we have two things called WordPress. There's WordPress.org, which is the open source kind of community, nonprofit side of things. And there's WordPress.com, which is actually owned by Automattic, and the place you come to get our SaaS version, or software as a service version of Automattic, of WordPress. And that's a little bit confusing. So I might have called them something different if I were starting today. And just, I think it's good to have each product have its own kind of name, and there being a clear distinction between the functionality of each of them. So.
Oh, wow, it doesn't sound like there are many regrets there. Matt, thank you so much for this conversation.
Can I throw in one thing in closing?
Please.
One thing I like, it's funny this is called corner office, because I think people who choose to have offices are usually the bosses, and they often have a really nice office. I've been to offices of billionaire CEOs that have their own private bathroom, beautiful art, a couch. These are all things that you can have in your house. And what I love about a distributed organization is every single employee can have a corner office. So I just wanted to say that as for people listening.
And what is your office like? Where do you work out of in Houston, where you are today?
Yeah, during the pandemic, I have had to adjust because I'm used to working home alone. And, I have had other people working from home also. So I actually moved upstairs to a room that was unused and just kind of set it up as a closed office with a door. I have lots of art around me because I find art really inspiring. I have some Sonos speakers to listen to music, and a cool kind of wood desk that kind of connects me to nature while I'm here, and a meditation cushion here, and a chair I can relax in.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for being in the corner office even while you're at home, Matt.
My pleasure. It was a great
And
conversation.
yeah, and thank you to everyone for joining today's call. Before we finish, let me just say thank you to all our listeners. Thanks also to the team at the New York Times who have worked hard to make these calls happen. We've had several of these over the last few months, and unfortunately today, this will be the last live call for a little bit. We're going to take a break. We'll still be doing corner office column in the Sunday business section of the New York Times. And stay tuned. We're going to bring more digital events in the future. In the meantime, to see what more we do have on tap, go to timesevents.nytimes.com. And thank you all very much for joining us. Hope you're all well. Bye-bye. And thanks again, Matt.
Bye-bye.